The job was a lifeline, or so I told myself. A 6-month stint as the sole keeper of this St. Jude's End lighthouse, a stone sentinel on a jagged tear of rock 3 miles off the coast. After Sarah left, the city felt like a tomb, each street corner a monument to a life that was no longer mine. The isolation of St. Jude's seemed less a punishment and more a necessary amputation. The lighthouse was a relic, a proud old man of a building, its granite walls bearded with sea salt and lichen. The light was automated. My job was simply to maintain the machinery, report back to the mainland, and ensure the foghorn's mournful cry never faltered. The previous keeper, a man named Alistair Finch, had left the place in immaculate condition. His logbooks were filled with meticulous, looping script detailing weather patterns and maintenance schedules. The last entry was odd, though. Dated the day of his departure, it read simply, "She's still singing. I can't bear it anymore." I dismissed it as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too much time alone. The first few weeks were peaceful. The rhythmic sweep of the light, the percussive crash of waves against the rocks, the groan of the old structure. It was a symphony of solitude, and I was its only audience. The singing began on a moonless night in my 2nd month. It was faint at first, a high, lilting melody that seemed to be carried on the wind. I thought it was a trick of the gulls or the whistle of wind through the ironwork of the lantern room, but it returned the next night, and the next, always just after dusk. It was a woman's voice, beautiful, and yet imbued with a profound sorrow. It was a wordless lullaby that promised not comfort, but an eternal, lonely grief. I started to feel a constant, gnawing chill that had nothing to do with the Atlantic drafts. I'd be polishing the great Fresnel lens and catch a flicker of movement in its multifaceted surface, a shape that wasn't my own reflection. A scent, like rain-soaked lavender, would drift through the keeper's quarters, only to vanish when I tried to find its source. Driven by a creeping dread, I delved into the history of the lighthouse, poring over the older logbooks I found in a sea-worn chest. In a volume from 1888, I found him, Captain Thomas Griffin, the first keeper of St. Jude's End. His entries spoke of a deep love for his wife, Alara, who lived with him on the rock. He wrote of her voice, how it was more beautiful than any siren's call. Then the entries turned dark. Alara, heavy with their first child, had been swept from the rocks during a sudden violent storm. Thomas's grief was a raw wound on the page. His handwriting grew frantic, erratic. He wrote of hearing her singing their child's lullaby from the waves. He became obsessed with joining her. The final entry from that year was not in his hand. It was a clipped report from a Coast Guard officer stating that Captain Griffin had been lost to the sea, presumed to have thrown himself from the lantern gallery. The phenomenon in the lighthouse intensified. The singing was no longer a distant melody on the wind. It was inside, echoing up the spiral staircase as if the lighthouse itself was her throat. Doors I had bolted would be found ajar. The great brass foghorn would sometimes issue a low guttural moan when there was no fog in sight, a sound that resonated deep in my chest. One night, as a thick fog, as white and blinding as a shroud, finally rolled in, the true terror began. The singing was all around me, a chorus of one that seemed to come from every direction at once. I was in the lantern room, the beam of light cutting a ghostly swath through the mist. My breath plumed in front of me, the cold now absolute. And then I saw her. She was standing on the narrow gallery outside the glass, her form translucent against the swirling fog. A young woman in a simple, drenched 19th century dress, her long, dark hair plastered to her face. Her eyes were voids of black, and from her open mouth came the heartbreaking lullaby. But the sound wasn't just coming from her. It was coming from the glass, from the metal, from the very air I was breathing. I stumbled back, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Her form flickered, and for a horrifying instant, she was inside the lantern room with me, her icy presence raising goosebumps on my skin. She drifted towards me, her feet not touching the floor. The scent of lavender and the cold, salty brine of the deep ocean was overpowering. She raised a spectral hand, not in menace, but in a gesture of pleading. The singing stopped, and a single word, a whisper that was both the sigh of the wind and the hiss of the waves, filled the silence. Thomas. The foghorn blasted then, a deafening, soul-shaking roar, though I was nowhere near the controls. The entire tower shuddered, the light flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness, broken only by the faint, ethereal glow of the woman before me. "He won't come to me," the whisper echoed, filled with a century of loneliness. "He is afraid of the water." She drifted closer, her face inches from mine. In the black pits of her eyes, I saw not malice, but an unbearable, desperate solitude. She wasn't a monster. She was a broken heart, trapped in an endless loop of loss. "Sing with me," she whispered, the cold of her presence seeping into my bones. Her demand was not a request. It was a command born of a love that had curdled into a relentless, supernatural obsession. I could feel my own will eroding. My own grief for Sarah was a tiny, flickering candle against the hurricane of her sorrow. The lullaby began to form on my own lips, an unbidden, horrifying impulse. I was to be the bait to lure a century-old ghost from his watery grave.